In this video, I'll be showing you how to build an entire AI application, including a front end, back end, and then various integrations. We'll be using React for the front end and then TypeScript within React as well as for some of the back end components. This is a great video because not only will it show you how to integrate AI into your applications, but how you can actually present this to a user and build it into a full-fledged application that includes a front end, which many other videos on YouTube don't actually have. So with that said, let me give you a quick demo of the application. This is meant to act as a base and something you can extend and add upon, and is really just teaching you the core features you need to know so you can build your own applications. So right here, what I have is a trip planner. Now, any of you that follow me or maybe follow my second channel, Life with Tim, know that I've been traveling around the world recently, and it can be difficult to keep track of the different trips that I have. So what I wanted to do is build something relatable to myself and probably to some of you. So the kind of idea here is that you can keep track of different trips that you have and when you're going on them, and then you can add some notes related to those trips. So for example, in Canada, I can say I am going to visit the CN Tower. Okay, so just add a note on something that I want to do, and I can add maybe flight plans, accommodation, whatever I want, and just have a really quick way to kind of view all of my trip details. Now I can add another trip here from this form where we have all of these different countries with a start date and an end date, but the coolest part is the AI component of this application. So I have a box which is ask a question, and I can ask this any question about the various trips that I have, and it's able to actually give me a response by using my data. So I can say something like, hey, what am I planning to do in, if we spell this correctly, Albania? And when I ask this question, it will take a second, and then it's going to give me a response that will utilize the data I have in this application. So you can see here it gave me a response, and it says in Albania you have the following planned, and it's taking this directly from my notes and the information that we have in this application. So that's really the cool part here. This AI that I'm going to show you can actually interact with the data that you have in the app, and that means it can give you reasonable responses, it can summarize different things that you're doing, and you can add so many cool features to this, as you're going to see in this video. So with that said and the demo complete, let's talk about how we're going to build this application. Now, in order to build this project out, we're going to be using something known as Squid AI, otherwise known as Squid. Now, they are the sponsor of this video, but their platform is free. You do not need to pay to use it, and this acts as a backend as a service that lets you connect and secure any database or API in minutes. So it doesn't matter if it's NoSQL, SQL, GraphQL, HTTP, Squid allows you to integrate with your data through streamlined SDKs, and it makes it really easy to build out the type of application that you saw, where if we were doing this completely from scratch, it could take us weeks, and in this video you'll see it's not going to take us that long to build out this entire app. It also allows us to add AI directly into our application with different integrations. You're going to see it in this video, but even though it is the sponsor, it's a very cool platform, and I think it's really going to help a lot of you building out these type of apps. Anyways, to get started, what we're going to need to do here is create a new account with Squid. Again, this is free. I'll link it in the description. Go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to walk you through the next steps of creating our Squid application, and then we'll get right into the code. So once you've created your Squid account, you should be brought to a page that looks something like this. If you're not on this page, you can just go through the simple onboarding, and then you should see some page that looks like this. And what we're going to do is go over to onboarding. Now from onboarding, we have a few different options where there's some sample applications that we can start with, but what I want to do is just start with an empty application. So I'm going to click, I want to start with an empty starter app. From here, we're going to give this a name. I'm just going to call this Trip Planner Tutorial because I'm doing this for the video, and you can choose your different region and provider, but I'm just going to go with AWS. Okay, so now what it's going to do is give us a command that we can copy into our terminal, and this will kind of initialize our project and connect to the various Squid services so that when we eventually deploy this application, everything's just set up and ready to go. So I'm going to copy this command and head over to Visual Studio Code. Notice that I've already opened up a folder, and what I'm going to do is just paste this command here where I want to create this project, and it's going to create a directory for me that contains all of the code that we need. Now we do need to install this package here. So let's go ahead and click on yes or type yes, and it should install everything for us, create this directory, and then we can start writing some code. So now that we've initialized the application, I just want to discuss some of the different components that we have access to here and why we're using Squid AI. Now we have a backend, a front end, and then various different integrations. Now, the back end allows us to do things like create an API, interact with our data securely. We can have webhooks, cron jobs, etc. There's a lot of stuff we can do here, and we can actually interact with some of the AI integrations for our application. Now, during development, this backend is going to run locally on our computer, and then when we're finished, we can actually deploy this out and then connect to that from any of our front-end clients. Now, the backend is using something known as the Squid Backend SDK. You don't need to worry too much about that, but that's what allows us to write a lot of these kind of features very easily, and you'll see that in a second. Next, we have the front end. Now, the front end is our client. This will interact with the Squid backend, which is running locally, and that's what will allow it to actually access data sources, again, access the AI, and just do all of the things that a client would do. So the client is going to be our forward-facing kind of user interface, the website that you saw. It's going to integrate or interact with that Squid backend to access the various features and data that it needs. Now, the front end is going to use the Squid Client SDK, which is wrapped by either the React SDK or the Angular SDK. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but the point is that we have these really nice libraries or SDKs provided by Squid that have all of these features built in that make it really easy for us to actually integrate with our data sources and utilize AI features, and that's why we're using Squid. So with that in mind, let's just run this application to make sure that it's working, and you can see kind of what it looks like and how it works. And then we're going to start integrating this, with our own data, and you'll see how we build that application I showed you before from scratch. So what I'm going to do is cd into this directory, so cd into trip planner tutorial, and then I'm just going to do the npm run start command. Now this is going to spin up both the front end and the back end for me locally, and then it should automatically open this in a browser window. So let me just go back here and bring down my browser. Okay, so this is what the starter application looks like. You can see we have a little bit of a front end here, and I can click on this button and increment the count. This count is stored in the back end, and we're incrementing this using something known as a webhook. You don't really have to worry too much about that, but this is just what the sample application is. So you can see here, we're running the front end and the back end, and I'm interacting with the back end and incrementing this count every single time I press this button. That's kind of how this sample application is set up. Now we're going to kind of tear down or remove a lot of the code for this sample app and work on our own app, but this is running, a Squid application. So if we want to quit this, we can just go ahead and hit on Control C, and then we can clear the console here. And what I'm going to do now is go over to my Squid console. So I'm going to click on Done because I've gone through these steps, and I want to show you how we kind of create our own data source or schema here, and we can start actually adding data to the database and start interacting with it. So in order to do that, we're going to click on integrations here, and you'll see that there's some integrations that are built in by default. For example, we have a built-in database, which is what we're going to use, but we can integrate this with any database that we want. Maybe we have some other data we want to bring in from another application. We have a queue, we have storage, and then we can also add things like an API, an AI chatbot, and all these other integrations that Squid will allow us to work with really easily. So what we want to do is click on the three dots here for our database, and we're going to start defining the schema that we want to use for the different data that we have. Now you can see for the sample app, it just has this count collection. Now we're not going to work with this count collection, but it's just here because that's what was in the sample application. But what I want to do is I want to create a trips collection. Now, for this application, we're going to be storing various trips, So we need to figure out the fields that we want to have for our trips and the type of information that we want to store. Now, in my case, I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm going to go with the country of the trip that we're going on or where we're going, the start date, the end date, and then we're going to have some kind of notes associated with the trip. So let's go ahead and add those fields here. The first field I'm going to go with is the start date. This is going to be a date object, so let's change the type here. We can give that a default value if we want. We're going to say that yes, this is required, and we're just going to give this a small description. The reason we'll give this a description is so that the AI that will interact with our data and give us those summaries you saw before knows what this field means. We're going to say start date of the trip. This one's pretty straightforward, but we'll just give it a short description. Now we're going to add another field here, and after the start date, of course, we're going to want to have the end date. So let's spell the end date correctly. Let's make this a date as well. We're going to make this required. We're going to say end date of the trip. Okay, now we're going to add the country. So let's go country. We'll make this a string. This will be required as well. If we wanted a minimum or maximum length, we could do that. We'll say country the trip is in. Okay, And now let's add another field, and this one is going to be notes. Now these will just be some notes associated with the trip, so that's going to be an array. This will be required as well, and we'll say notes related to, if we could type this correctly, to the trip. Okay, so we're going to add that field. And then lastly, we're also just going to add an ID. So we're going to say ID. We'll actually make this a string, and then we'll say that this is required, and this is going to be the primary key, and we'll say unique ID of the trip. Okay, so we have the 5 fields that we need for this data source. I'm going to go ahead and click on Save Schema. Now at this point, if we wanted to, we could go to Query with AI, and if we had any information inside of this database, we could ask questions about it, and it would actually give us some response. This is what we're going to be building into our AI application and using from the front end, but here you can see you can test with it, and also it's worth noting this can create graphs, charts, etc. It's pretty cool. So we'll look at that later when we have some data, but for now we have a collection, ID, country, end date, notes, and the start date. And obviously, if you had more data, you could add it here, or if you wanted to integrate with another database, you could do that. In our case, this is totally fine. So let's go back to our application now that we have the schema defined. And what we want to do is start setting up this app so that we actually have the code that we need for our application. Now remember that we need the ability to add a trip, we need to add notes to a trip, we need to be able to remove a trip, and then we need the ability to query about our database. So I think logically the first thing that makes sense is to actually add a trip. So let's go in here and let's start setting up our app so that we can add a trip from the front end, and then we can start adding some backend components, AI, etc. So let's go into our app.tsx. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that we can read this. And we're just going to start cleaning this up a bit because we really don't need a lot of the code that's here. For example, I don't need that squid logo. I don't need whatever I had up here. And we can pretty much delete everything that we have inside of this component. And what we're going to do instead is we're just going to return an empty component. And we can even remove these hooks right here from the Squid Cloud React SDK. So now we just have a blank app. That's good. Let's go into index.css. We can pretty much remove everything here as well. I'll just keep the root styling so that we keep some of these main features. We can go to app.css. We can get rid of this as well. And now we kind of have a clean slate and we can start writing the different code that we need. So as I said, the first thing that we want to do is probably create a form that allows us to add a new trip. So to do that, I'm going to make a new component. So I'm going to say components and make a folder here. And inside of the components folder, I'm going to make a new file. And we're going to call this the add trip form. So let's do that. And then this is going to be TSX. Now, as well as that, I'm going to add some CSS for this. So I'm going to say add trip form.css. And inside of here, I'm actually just going to copy and paste a bunch of CSS later on. Now, for this project, I'm not going to be writing all of the CSS from scratch because that's going to take a really long time, and you guys probably don't want to just watch me write CSS. So I have all of the code available from the link in the description. If you're getting lost or you just want to reference something or copy and paste it, you can go there and just check out all of the code. And for the CSS specifically, I'm just going to get you to copy and paste that into your application so that we don't spend a ton of time styling the app, which again, you're not going to get a ton of value from. Anyways, let's start out with our add trip form. So what we're going to do is we're going to import React, and we're going to import a few other things that we need, like the use state and the use effect, and that's going to be from the React package. Okay, now we might as well import that CSS while we have it. So we're going to say from and then, or import, add trip form.css, and then we can go here and make our component. So we're going to say function add trip. And inside of add trip, we're going to create a form, and the form is to make the trip. So we're going to need a country, a start date, an end date, and then anything else for the trip, I guess some notes, but we're going to add those later on. So let's start defining some state that we're going to use for our form. So we're going to say const country and then set country is equal to use state. And for now, that's going to be an empty string. We're going to say const start date and then set start date is equal to use state. This will be an empty string as well. We're going to do the same thing if I fix my semicolon here with the end date. So we're going to say end date and then set end date is equal to use state. And that's going to be a string. And then we're also going to have a piece of state that's going to store all of the different countries that we have available to us. The reason for this is that we're going to actually use an API to grab all of the different countries that exist so that we can populate kind of that selection box that we had, because we don't want to just manually type out all of the different countries. We're going to grab those from an API just to save us some time. So I'm going to say const, and we're going to go with countries, and then set countries is equal to use state, and this is going to be a list actually of all the different countries. And then we're actually just going to grab all of these countries using a useEffect hook. So let's explain this, but we're going to say useEffect. We're going to have a function here. The dependency array will just be empty. And inside of here, we're going to make an API call to an API that I found that just gives us a list of all of the different countries so that we can populate those and allow them just to select a country from the list. So we're going to fetch, and the URL that we're going to fetch is the following. I'm just going to copy it in so that I don't mess it up, and then you guys can copy it as well. So let's go here. This is the restcountries.com/v3.1/all. This is free. You don't need any API token or anything, so it's really easy to call. We're going to say .then. We're going to take in some response, and let's just save this, and we're going to say if the response.ok, then we are going to return the response.json, and I just need to put this inside of a set of curly braces so that I don't get yelled at. Let's format this so that you guys can actually read it. Okay, so we're saying .then, we get a response. If the response is okay, we'll return the JSON from the response. We're then going to need another .then. We're going to take in the data from that JSON, and what we're going to do is we're going to map this data. So we're going to say const, and this is going to be the country names, is equal to data.map. We're going to take in a country, and then we are going to do country.name.common, because this has a bunch of information, not just the name of the country. So we're going to get the name and then the common name, because there's abbreviations and all kinds of other data that exists from this result. So I'm just going to mark this as an any type so that TypeScript doesn't get mad at us. And then I'm going to set countries. So we're going to say set countries, and we're going to set it as our country names. Okay, so now we're retrieving the data from the API. Let's just add one more clause here in case there's an error. So we're going to have a .catch. We're going to have an error, and then we're just going to say console.error like that, and we'll just log whatever the error is so that we can see what that issue is. Okay, so at this point, once we render this component, what it's going to do immediately is go and fetch all of the countries, set that in the country state, and then we can use that in our form. So let's start making the form now, which is just going to be a little bit of HTML. So we're going to say return. We're going to return a div. Now it's important that you specify the class names properly here so that they match up with the CSS that I have. So for the class name of this div, I'm going to call this a trip container. And let's save that. Inside of this div, I'm just going to add an h3 tag as a header. We're going to say that this is add trip with no class. Then we're going to create the form. So we're going to say div class name is equal to the trip dash form. Okay, now inside of here, we're going to add our different form elements. So the first element we're going to have is a select field. This is to select the country. So we're going to say the value is equal to our country state, which we have defined up here. And then we need to specify an onChange. So we're going to say onChange, and this needs to be a function. So we're going to specify an arrow function that takes in e and says set country. And when we set the country, this is going to be e.target.value. Okay, let's save that. Now inside of the select here, we're going to specify all of the different options that we have. So the first option, like this, is going to be the following. We're going to say option value is equal to empty. We're going to say this is disabled, and this is just going to say select country. So this is what you'll see in the picker, but you can't actually select this. And then we're going to map all of the different countries that we have as various options inside of the select. So we're going to say countries.map. Okay, and we're going to take in the country, and what we're going to return from the country is an option. The option is going to have a key. The key will just be equal to the country. The text itself will be the country, and the value will be equal to the country as well. So let's save so that we can see this. So now you can see that we have various different options for all our different countries with the key and the value and the name. Okay, so those are all of the values inside of the select. Next, we need some date pickers. So we're going to have an input For the input, we're going to say the type is equal to date. Now the value, of course, is going to be equal to the start date because that's what we will have first. And then we're going to say on change. Okay, and this needs to be a function. We're going to take in e and we're going to say set the start date. And then this is going to be e.target.value. Okay, now we can just copy the same thing. Let me just make this a bit bigger so that you guys can see it. And I'm not sure why it did that. So let's copy this line and paste this down here and just change this from start date to end date. And rather than set the start date, this will be set the end date. Okay, now lastly, we're going to make a button. This button is going to say add trip. Okay, and we're going to have an on click, which is equal to, and we're going to call a function called add trip, which we're going to define in just 1 second. Okay, so this is the form. I know that was just a lot of typing there, but it's actually not too complex. We just have a selector for the country, some inputs for the start date and for the end date, and then a button for the add trip. Now we just need to handle actually adding the trip. So we're going to make a function called add trip. Okay, we can just make this an arrow function here. When we press this, we want to create a new trip in our database. So how do we do that? Well, to do that, we're going to use the Squid client SDK or the React SDK. So what I'm going to do up at the top here is I'm going to say import, and I'm going to import use collection from, and this is going to be at Squid. So let's put that in a string. At squidcloud/react. Okay, so this is a hook that we can use to get access to a specific collection. So now what I can do is I can say const trips collection is equal to, and then use collection. And then what we're going to specify is actually the schema of the collection, which I'll do in a second, and then the name in our database, which is trips. Now what we want to put here, since we're using TypeScript, is actually the type or what a trip looks like so that we're able to get that autocomplete from TypeScript. So in order to do that, we need to make a new type. So what we're going to do is say type, and then this is going to be trip. And that's going to look like this. So for the type trip, we're going to have a start date, which is a date. We're going to have an end date, which is a date. We're going to have a country, which is a string. We're going to have some notes, which is going to be a string array. And then we're going to have an ID, which is also going to be a string. Okay, so that's the type for our trip. And then what I can do is specify that here. And now what I'm doing is saying, okay, I want to use this collection from Squid. So what we defined there in our Squid Cloud or Squid console, the name within the database is trips, but each trip looks like this type. So this way, when I start interacting with the collection, I have the auto completion and I actually know what this looks like. Okay, so now that I have the trips collection here, it's actually really easy to add a new element. To do that, all we need to do is say trips collection dot document. Okay, we're going to create a new document. And then we can say insert, and we're just going to insert the data that we want. That's literally it. If you've worked with NoSQL databases before, you've probably seen something like this, but here this is giving us a reference to that trips collection, and then we can just add a new element to it. Now, the first thing we'll do before we add the element is just define an ID for this trip. So we're going to say const trip ID is equal to, and then we're going to use the crypto package, which is built in here, and then random UUID. This is going to give us a random value for the ID to identify this trip. For the document, we're just going to specify that we want the ID to be trip ID. And then we can start writing all of our fields. So we're going to say the ID we want is the trip ID. We're going to say that we want to have the country. Then we also want to have the start date, and this is going to be a new date, and we're just going to wrap the start date string here so we convert that to a date object. We're going to say end date, and this is going to be new date, and then the end date, and then we're going to have notes, and this will be an empty array. Now notice once I fill in all of those fields, then the red squiggly line goes away because now we have fulfilled the schema or the type that we specified here, which is kind of the nice benefit of using TypeScript. Now that actually completes our add trip form. Lastly, we need to export this component and then just render it from our main component so that we can use it and try it out. So I'm going to say export default, and then this is going to be add trip like this. Okay, so that is now this component exported. And what we're going to do just to clean up the code a little bit is we're going to take this type and we're just going to put it in a types file. So I'm going to go to source. I'm going to make a new file called types.ts. I'm going to put this in here with an export before it. And now what I'm going to do is remove this type and just import it from that file that we created, so that this way we don't actually need to define the type in one file because we might use it in multiple places. So now you can see that I'm importing trip from /types. That's where we have it defined. And now if we use it somewhere else, we don't need to redefine it. Okay, so that is our add trip component. The last thing to do is add the CSS for this. So again, what I'm going to do is just copy this in. If you want all of the CSS, it's available from the link in the description, and it's just in the file add trip form.css. You can view it directly from GitHub. So I'm going to copy all of that in. Again, this just kind of makes it look a little bit nicer. It's not worth us writing all of it out together in this video. Okay, so now we need to render this component so we can test it and actually view it. So I'm going to go to app.tsx. Inside of my fragment here, I am going to render that component, which is the add trip. Okay, and that's it. So you can see that this automatically gets imported here from components.addTripForm. If it's not, then you can just type the import. We will format our code. And now what we can do is run it and make sure the component renders. So we're inside of that directory, trip planner, and I can type npm run start. When I do that, it's just going to take a second here, and then we can see that we have our add trip form. Now, obviously, all of the styling's not finished yet because we have some more CSS that we'll add later on. But you can see that I can select a country, so it has my whole list here of all of the different countries. They're not necessarily in alphabetical order, but if we wanted them to be, we could map them in that way. I'll select Belize. Let's go with something like, it's going to start on the 24th and then go to the 31st. Now let's just open up the console here to see if this is going to work. I'm going to click on add trip. Now at this point, we don't actually know if it's working or not because there's no way to view all of the different trips in our UI. But what we can do is we can check our backend. We don't see any errors here, so hopefully that means that it's working. And we can go to our Squid console and we can actually query with AI and see if we have a trip to Belize. So let's go query with AI. Let's say, hey, what trips do I have? If it says I have some trips, that means that this was probably successful. If it says that I don't have any trips, then I guess it means that didn't work. And I'm going to show you how we can kind of allow access to that database. So you can see here, after asking this, it gave us a result. It says you have the following trips planned, country is Belize, start date, end date, and there are no notes for this trip. It shows us the query that it actually used to find this information, and then gave us a walkthrough step-by-step of what it did in order to format this response. Now, this can also generate charts and graphs if you add some data that makes sense for that, but this is pretty cool, and that's exactly why I want to add this to our application so that we can use this directly from the UI. Anyways, you can see that trip was now added. So let's move on to the next steps here where we start actually viewing the different trips that we have, and then we can integrate or add that add AI form. So let's go to components here, and we're going to make two new components, one for rendering an individual trip, and then one for rendering the list of trips. So we're going to go new component, and we're going to say trip.tsx. This will kind of be the individual trip, and then we're going to have the trip list.tsx. And while we're at it, we're going to add the CSS file. So we're going to say trip.css, and then we will have the trip list.css. Okay, so let's start by rendering one individual trip, and then we can render the list of all of the trips that we have. All right, so for one trip, we're going to say import format. We're going to use this in a second for the date from, and this is a built-in package called datefns. We're then going to say import, and this is going to be trip from ... /types because we want that trip type. And then we're going to have some states. We're going to say import use state from, and this is going to be React. Okay. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to write the different props that we're going to have for this component. We're going to start rendering it, and yeah, you'll see how it works. So we're going to say type props is equal to, and first thing we're going to need to render a trip, well, we need to know what the trip is that we're rendering. So let's specify that. Now we're also going to have some functions. We're not going to write these functions or implement them yet, but we know that we're going to need them. So for example, we need the ability to delete a trip. So we're going to say on delete. We're going to pass some ID. This will be the ID of the trip we want to delete, and this function will return void. We're then going to have add on note or on add note, and this is going to be the trip ID. So the trip ID we want to add the note for, as well as the note itself that we want to add, and this again will return void. We're then going to have the on delete note, because within each trip we have notes and we need to potentially delete them. Same thing, we're going to have the trip ID, and we're going to have the index of the note that we want to delete, which is a number, and then this is going to return void. Next, we're just going to have some index, and this will specify what index this specific trip is. Okay, so now let's write our component. We're going to say function, and this is going to be trip card. Now for the props, we're just going to strip them out. So we're going to say trip on delete, on add note, on delete note, and index. And this is coming from our props type, just kind of good practice here with TypeScript. Now what is the issue it's saying here? All these structured elements are unused. Okay, that's fine. We'll use them in a second. Let's format this, go down, and start writing our component. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to say const new note, and then set new note. This is going to be the field that will store the kind of input for adding a new note, because we need the ability to add a note to our individual trips. Okay, now we're going to write the actual HTML that we want to render here. So we're going to say return. We're going to have a div. We're going to say the class name here is equal to the trip dash card, and we're going to give this a key, which is equal to the index, just so we don't get those key errors coming from React. Now inside of here, what we want to display is the name of the trip, the start date, the end date, and then there's a bunch of different functionality we need, like we need to view all of the different notes, we need the ability to add a note, to delete a note, and then also to delete the trip itself, because that's something we might potentially want to do. So we're going to start with an H4 tag, which is going to show kind of the header components, so like the country name and the start date and the end date. We're going to have a span here, and inside span, what we're going to do is we're going to format, and this is going to be the trip dot start date. We're going to format this as PPP, which is going to give us a nicely formatted date. Then we're going to put a dash, not a minus sign, but a dash here. So let's go outside of this curly brace. We're going to have another curly brace, and we're going to do format, and then this is going to be trip dot end date. And then same thing, format it with PPP, just so that it looks nice, and it just gives us the month, date, and year. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to display. Now after that, we're going to have a button, and for the button, we're going to say the class name is equal to country button, just in case we eventually want to add some functionality on click here, although we're not going to do that right now. And we're going to render the trip.country name. Then beside all of that, we're going to have another button. The class name of this is going to be the delete dash button. And for the delete button, we're of course going to call it delete, and we're going to have an on click event. The on click event is going to call the on delete, because this is to delete the trip. And what we're going to do is just pass to this function the trip.id. If you look at our props, the on delete function takes the ID of the trip that wants to be deleted. So we're just going to pass that trip.id, and then we will actually delete this trip. Okay, so all of that's in the header, so that's going to appear in kind of the first row. And now we're going to render the different notes that we have. So we're going to use UL for the unordered list, and then we're going to map all of our notes. So we're going to say trip.notes.map. Okay, for this, we are going to take in the note as well as the note index. Okay, and then we're going to return a component that we want to render. So we're going to render a list item, The key of this is going to be the note index, and then we're going to have a class name, and this will be equal to note. Now inside of the li, we're just going to render the note itself, and we're just going to put a space at the end, and then we're going to have a button. Okay, and the button here is just simply going to be an X, and we're going to have class name equal to delete dash button, and then we're going to have the on click equal to, and this is going to be an arrow function that's going to call our on delete note. To delete a note, we need the ID of the trip, so we're going to say trip.id, and we need the index of the note we want to delete. So let's just save that so we can read it. And you can see here that we're rendering the note. We have our X button to delete the note, which is going to appear at the edge of it, or the far right edge based on the CSS. We have an on click, and what we're doing is just passing to the function the ID of the trip and the note specifically that we want to delete. Okay, so that's it for rendering the different notes. Now the last thing we need is the ability to add a note. So we're going to make a div. We're going to say the class name is equal to the note dash form. And then inside of here, we're going to have an input field because we need the user to be able to write the new note. For the input, this is going to be type is equal to text. We're then going to have the class name, which is equal to the note dash input. And then we're going to have the value, which is equal to the new note. And then we're going to have the onChange, which is equal to E. And then this is going to be the set new note. And this will be e.target.value. Okay, again, let's save that. And then lastly, we can add a placeholder here to our input. So let's do that. Placeholder. And this will be equal to add a note. Okay. Lastly, we need a button to submit this. So we're going to say button add note. Let's give this a class name for our styling. So we'll say class name is equal to add note dash button. And then we're going to say on click is equal to, and this is going to be the following, the handle add note, which is a function we're going to define in 1 second. So don't worry about that. For this, we're going to pass the trip.id and the new note. Okay, let's save this. And there we go. We have finished the form. Okay, let's quickly run through this. We have a div, which represents one individual trip. We display the main information about the trip, which is the country, the start date to the end date, and then the ability to delete it. We then render all of the different notes associated with an individual trip, and then we have a div here for adding the note. So we have the actual input for the note, and then we have a button that allows us to add it, and then we just have a function we need to define, which allows us to add the new note. So what I'm going to do is say const, and this is handle add note. Now recall that what this is going to take is the trip ID. So we're going to say trip ID, this is going to be a string, and then we also need the note that we want to add, which is also a string. The reason why I'm writing this function is I just want to trim the note to make sure we don't include any trailing spaces, and then I'm going to pass it to that function. So I'm going to say if note.trim does not equal an empty space. So as long as you give us some real content, then I'm going to say on add note, and I'm just going to pass to this the trip ID and then the note.trim. So I'm just trimming that. And then I'm going to say set new note. And this is going to be an empty string. Okay, so when I add a new note, well, I'm going to pass it to that function, which will add the new note for me. And then I'm just going to set the internal state here to be empty so that I can add another note without having to delete that content. So this is pretty much all that we need here for this. I'm realizing the date FNS is not actually a built-in package, so I believe we are going to need to install that. So we can do that right now. Let's go up here. Let's close this. Let's clear, and let's type npmi and then date-fns, just so we have access to that format package. Okay, so now we should be good here once this refreshes. So let's refresh here, the Explorer, and now notice that we are all good. We can rerun our application with npm run start. And now we need to actually render these trip cards if we want to see them. So let's go down here and let's go export default trip card. Okay, let's add the CSS for the trip card, and then let's do the list, which is going to be quite simple. All right, so I have the trip CSS. I'm just going to paste all of it in here. Okay, so you guys will be able to find that again from the link in the description. Let's remove that because that's actually the wrong header, and then we can format this so that it's nice and pretty. Okay, so now we have the trip component done, we have the CSS, and now we need to do the trip list. Okay, so for our trip list, this is going to be quite simple. We're just going to render all of the trip cards. So to do this, we're going to say import React from React. We're then going to say import trip. This is the type from /types. We're then going to import the trip card from /trip. Okay, and then we're going to define our props. So for this, we're going to say type props. Let's zoom in a little bit, and we're going to take all of our different trips. So we're going to say trip and this will be an array. We're going to say on delete because we need the same functions here that we're going to pass to our trip. So we're going to say this is ID string, and then this will be void. And actually, we can make this a little bit faster by just copying these three functions because we're going to have the exact same. So let's just paste these here: on delete, on add note, on delete note, because these are going to come from our main app component. And now we can make this component. So we're going to say function trip list. Same thing, we're going to destructure these. So we're going to say trips on delete, on add note, and then on delete note, like that. This is coming from our props. Okay. Then here we're going to return a div. Inside of the div, we're going to say the class name is equal to the trip list container. And then inside of the div, we are going to show all of our trips. So we're going to say trips and trips dot map. We're going to take in the trip and the index, and we're going to render a trip card. Okay, so let's save this and format it and now start writing all of the props. Now the reason I'm doing this is to make sure I do actually have some trips. If you did pass me some trips, then I will start mapping them out. Okay, so for our trip card, first thing we need is the key. The key is going to be the index here. We're then going to pass the actual trip itself, which will just be the trip from this map. Then we are going to have the key. The key here is going to be the index as well. And sorry, this is not called key. We're actually going to call it index because that's something that we passed as a prop there. We're then going to say on delete is equal to, you guessed it, on delete. We're going to say on add note is equal to, you guessed it, on add note. And then lastly, on delete note is of course going to be on delete note. This is known as prop drilling, and you're not typically supposed to do this, but in our case, this is kind of a simple project. So it's fine here. We're just passing these different functions twice. So to this component and then to the internal component, we're not passing them through too many layers. So even though it's slightly bad practice, it's fine for this specific project. Anyways, now we're going to render this out. So we're going to say, or export this, sorry, export default trip list. Okay. And you can see now that we have the trip list where all we're doing is just inside of a container, just rendering all of these different trip card components and passing the various props that we need. Now I actually realized that I combined all of the CSS for trip list CSS inside of trip.css. So there's no need for us to, actually write any CSS inside of this file. So all I'm going to do is go to triplist.css and simply delete that file because we don't actually need that. And now we can render the trip list component from our main component and pass to it these various functions and trips. So let's go to app.tsx. We are going to import the trip list. And now underneath the add trip, we will simply render the trip list here, but we need to pass it a few different things in order for it to actually work. So we need to pass to it, for example, all of the different trips, and then we need to pass to it those functions. So on delete, on add note, and on delete note. So in order to get all of the trips, we can do a similar thing to what we did when we were adding a trip. So we're going to say import, and this is going to say use collection. And we're also going to import the use query hook, which is something that we can do to grab a specific trip, in this case, from the Squid React SDK. And we're going to start by grabbing our collection. So we're going to say const collection is equal to use collection. This is going to be using the trip type, which should be automatically imported there. And then we are going to specify that we want to grab the trips. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to get all of these trips. So in order to do that, we can say const trips is equal to, and then we can say use query, and we can just pass the collection here dot query. Now what this will do is simply query all of the different trips for us using this hook and just give us a nice list of all of the trips that we have. So this gives us a reference to the collection, but if we want all of the trips, this is the way that we grab them. So now we can pass those to our trips list. So we can say trips is equal to, and then we're going to pass the following. We're going to say trips.data.map, and then we are going to take our trip and we're going to render all of the data from that trip. This is just kind of how Squid Cloud gives us the data. It gives us trips.data, and then we need to grab all of the individual elements inside of that array, which is what we're doing, and then get all of their data because we have document references. And if we want the data inside of the document reference, well, then we need to just use this .data field. Okay, so we're just kind of mapping it out so that we get all of the data in a way that we can work with it. Now there is some functions that we need to add here, so let's stub them for now and then we can implement them. So we're going to say const delete is equal to, this is going to take in an ID string and then do something. Next one is going to be on add note. Okay, what is this one going to be? Let me just write this properly. This is going to be the trip ID, which is a string actually. And then it's going to be the note, which is also a string. And then we're going to have the const on delete note. Guess we need to spell const correctly. And this is going to be similar. It's going to be trip ID string and then note index, which is a number. Okay, I'm just stubbing these and we'll write the implementation in a second. For now, I just want to pass them. So we're going to say on delete is equal to on delete. Let's format that. We're going to say on add note is equal to on add note. And we're going to say on delete note is equal to on delete note. Okay, so now we have all of the functions and our trip list is rendering. We are running our code, okay, and you can see it's automatically updating whenever we do a save here. And when I come back, you can see that one of our trips is rendered. Now this trip doesn't look great. I'm not sure why the CSS is not updating. I believe what we might need to do here is go to our trip list and just import the trip CSS. So let's go. It's because we haven't imported the trip CSS, that's why. So from our trip list, we're gonna say import trip.css, okay? And now when I come back here, it says trip.css does not exist. I believe that does exist. Okay, let's see what the issue is here. And of course we need to do / so that it knows the reference there. And now you can see that we get our nicely formatted trip. Okay. Great. Now these functions currently aren't doing anything because I haven't actually implemented them. But you can see that we have our Belize trip showing up. And if we try to add another trip here, maybe to the Barbados, let's do another date range here, like the 8th of August to maybe the 10th, we can add it and you see that it shows up. Okay, great. So now that we're doing that, let's implement these functions so that these buttons actually work, and then we can get into the AI implementation. So let's go back here to app.tsx and let's write these functions. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is actually write a helper function that will help us find a trip so that we can modify it and either add or delete a note. So we're going to say const find trip, and we're going to take in an ID, okay? And what we're going to do here is the following. We're going to say return, and this is going to be trips.data.find, and we're going to look for a trip. And this is going to be the trip.data.id is equal to the ID that we're looking for. What this is going to do is just grab the individual trip where the ID matches the ID that we're looking for, so then we can actually modify this trip. Okay, first thing we should do probably is learn how to add a note. So let's implement actually the add note function first. Okay, so for add note, we're going to do the following. We're going to say const trip is equal to find trip, and we're going to pass the trip ID. Now we're going to make sure the trip exists. So we're going to say if not trip, then return, because if there's no trip, well, there's nothing we can do here. We're then going to say const notes are equal to, and we're going to grab the current notes that we have. So we're going to say trip.data.notes. Okay, now what we want to do is add a new note into this. So we're going to say notes.push, and we're going to push our new note, and then we need to update this trip. Now to update this trip, we're going to say trip.update, and then we're simply just going to pass an object with the fields we want to update. So very simple, we're going to say notes are now equal to the new notes. That's it. That allows us to add a new note. So we just grab the trip, find the current notes, add a new note into it, and then make sure we trigger this update operation. Update here is actually going to go to the database and perform that update. Perfect. So that is adding a note. Now let's do deleting the trip itself. So we're going to say const trip is equal to find trip. We'll pass the ID, and then we'll say if the trip exists. Then guess what? It's as simple as saying trip.delete. Okay, that's just going to delete it from our database. Now we're going to do the on delete note. Now for on delete note, we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to find the trip. So let's grab that. and make sure that it exists. If it doesn't exist, we can return. We also want to grab the notes. So we're going to say const notes are equal to trip.data.notes, but this time we just want to filter it so that we have only the notes that don't match this note index, because this is the one that we're removing. So we're going to say trip.update, and inside of here, we're going to pass our new notes. So we're going to say notes are equal to, and then this is going to be notes.filter. And when we filter this, we're going to take in an underscore, which would be the note itself, but in this case, I don't care about it, so I'm just using an underscore, and then index, and then it's going to be index does not equal the note index. And we got to spell filter correctly so that this works. So what the filter is doing here is just returning all of the different objects that do not match this index, which means we'll have all of them except the one that we want to remove, and that's how we will update our note. Okay, so that's pretty much it here in terms of deleting and adding the notes. I guess the only way to know if this is working is to go to the code and test it. So let's go here. We can refresh. You can see it takes a second and they pop up here. And let's try to add a note. So let's do something simple like hello world. And we can click on add and you can see the note gets added, and then I can delete it. Let's try to delete a trip and you can see that it gets deleted. Great, there you go. I refresh, it's still here. And go hello world, add a note, and say testing, add a note, say new note, add that in here, and you can see all these notes get added and everything is working properly. Perfect. So now that we have the trip list and we have the ability to add a trip, we want to add in this AI component that allows us to ask questions about our various trips. Now, let's go back here and let's just do a few small things to make this look a little bit better. First of all, so what I'm going to do is just bring in a little bit of styling here for my app. So I'm going to go to app.css. And I'm just going to copy in the CSS that I have from the GitHub. You could probably just pause this and write out as well if you want to. And then I'm going to go to my app.tsx, and I'm just going to make this a div and say class name is equal to card, just so that we get a bit better styling here. Okay, so I'm just adding a card, and I've added that card styling. And when I come back here, you can see all of this now kind of gets wrapped in a card, which looks quite a bit better. Okay, now let's add that Ask AI type feature. So what we're going to do is go to component. We're going to do Ask AI dot, and actually this will be all capitals .tsx. We'll add our styling as well. So add our Ask AI dot CSS. Okay, and let's start writing this. Okay, so we're going to say import useState from React. We're going to say import, and this is actually going to be use Squid now, a hook that's coming again from the React SDK. And then we're going to import our style sheet. So ask ai.css, and let's make sure we have the / this time. Now let's stub the components. We're going to say function ask AI, and this can return a fragment currently. And then what I'm going to do is say export default Ask AI. Okay, so I just want to get this kind of stubbed so we can start writing it in 1 second. Let's go to app.tsx and let's just render it above all of this so that it's already there when we want to start testing it. Okay, so now we have Ask AI here as one of the components we're rendering in app.tsx. However, before we can start using Ask AI, we need to actually build in this AI integration that allows us to interact with our database. Now, this is where we're actually going to go to the backend and we're going to write a Squid service. So when I go to backend here, I'm going to go to source. I'm going to go to service, and you see that we have this example service.ts. What we're going to do here is remove this webhook service because we don't need this because this was resetting the counter beforehand. And we're going to add in a new service which allows us to actually utilize an AI feature that queries our database. So inside of here, we're going to remove this import because we don't need that. We're going to get rid of the webhook and we're going to replace that with executable. Now what we can do is we can use a decorator to mark a function that we define inside of this class as executable, which means we can use it from the front end and execute some kind of operation. In this case, it's going to be interacting with an AI. So we're going to say at executable, and then we will put our parentheses, and we're going to define the name of our executable function. So we're going to say async, and then this is going to be ask question. We're going to take in a question, which is going to be a string, and this is going to return a promise that returns a string. Okay, now inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to grab an AI response which queries our database. So we're going to say const, and it's going to be AI response is equal to await, and it's going to be this dot squid. We have access to that because we're extending the squid service from this class. And from this dot squid, we're going to say dot AI, and then dot execute AI query. And we're going to specify what database we want to query. In this case, is going to be the built-in database, and what the question is going to be, which is simply question. So let's format that. Okay, so the idea here is that what we can do is from our backend, we have an executable function, and we're using Squid to generate an AI that can actually execute a query on the database. So whatever the question is that we asked, we'll just apply that to the database. It will go actually create a query to grab information from the database based on whatever we asked in natural language to a real query. Then what it's going to do is format that nicely using some kind of LLM model and give us that response. Now in the backend here, in case we want to see what's actually going on, we can log kind of what's happening with the question. So we can put inside of backticks here, question, and then we can just render what the question was. Let's do that. And then on the next line here, we can say query. And for the query, we can mark our AI response. And this is going to be dot executed query. And then we can do 2 question marks and say, well, if that's nothing, then we're going to say no query executed. And then down here, we're going to have the explanation. And for the explanation, we're going to do a similar thing, AI response dot explanation, and then question mark, and then we're going to have no explanation. Now the idea here is that what this is actually going to do is it's going to give us some kind of response, but it's going to generate a query that will grab specific data from the database that it uses in that response. It's then going to give us a step-by-step explanation of how it got that response or how it generated that, which we're just logging in the backend so we can see what's actually going on. Then what we're going to do is return the AI response dot answer. We just want the kind of brief answer. We don't want the explanation or the query that was generated. And that's it. We've now wrote a function that will actually interact with our database, and we can now call this from our front end because we've wrapped it into the backend. Now, rather than calling this example service, we can call it something like AI query. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we're just going to update the imports. So now we're just going to export asterisks from AI query so that when we actually deploy this, we have that deployed as well. Okay, so that is our AI query. Now let's look at how we actually use that from our front end. All right, so let's go to Ask AI and let's start writing this form because that's really what it is. You're going to be importing or asking some kind of question, so we need a way to do that. So let's have our state. We're going to say const, this is going to be text, set text is equal to use state. We're then going to say const, and this will be result, and then set result is equal to use state. We're then going to say const loading and then set loading because sometimes this can take a second, so we want to have some kind of loading indicator. We're going to say use state, and that's going to be false. And then we also need to use squid, so we're going to say const squid is equal to use squid so that we can actually utilize that AI feature. Okay, so now let's write our form. So we're going to convert this into a div. We're going to give this a class name of a container. And then inside of this div, we're going to have an h3, and we'll say ask a question, like that. Okay, now what we can do is have some input fields. So let's define our input. We'll say the type is equal to text. We then will say the value is equal to text, and we'll say onChange is equal to, we're going to take in e, and then we're going to mark our text as that. So set text, and this is going to be e.target.value. Okay, now after the input, we're going to have this kind of text that checks if we're loading. So we're going to say loading question mark, and then we can display some text that says loading ... Otherwise, we can display a button, and this button can say ask. Okay, and we're going to have an on click equal to, and then we're going to have a function here. I'm going to say ask pressed. Let's define that function quickly. We're going to say const ask pressed is equal to a function, and we'll write, oops, what that is in 1 second. Okay, now after that, we're going to have something that checks if we have a result. If we do have a result, then we're going to display a field that shows what that result is. If we don't have a result, we're not going to show anything because we don't just want to show an empty box. So this is kind of going to expand downwards as soon as we actually generate that result. So we're going to say result and then we're going to have a div. Now let's close the div. For the div, we're going to have a class name. The class name is going to be the result dash container. And then inside of this div, let's format this nicely. We are going to have a text area because we could have a long reply here. And for the text area, the value, of course, is going to be the result that was generated. We're going to have a rows, and we'll just make this equal to 4 by default. If you want it to be bigger to start, then you can change rows. And then we will have a button. This button is going to say on click is equal to, we're going to have another function in a second, which will close the result box because sometimes you may want to do that. And then we're going to have a class name, and the class name is going to be equal to the close button. So let's go close dash button. Okay, let's save and format, and let's that function close result is equal to this. And we can actually write this because it's very easy. We're just going to say set result is equal to an empty string. Okay, so now we have this Ask AI form. Let's add the CSS for it and just see what it looks like quickly, before we actually add the other functionality. So I'm just going to copy this in. Again, you can find this from the link in the description in the GitHub repository. And now if we go back, you can see that this is what our Ask Question form looks like. We can type inside of here. We have our box, and there you go. All right, so now we're going to actually implement the ask pressed function, which is going to integrate with the AI that we wrote in the backend. So first thing we want to make sure is that we have some text. So we're going to say if no text, then return, because, well, if we don't have any text, then we don't need to do anything. Then we're going to say set loading, and this is going to be true. Now after this, we're going to say our result is equal to await, and that means this needs to be an async function, so let's define that as async. And we're going to say await squid.execute, and this is going to be function. And then the name of the function is the one we defined in the backend, which is ask question. And then we're going to pass to this the text or the question. Then once this is finished, we're going to say set result. We're going to set the result. We're going to set the text equal to an empty string because now we're finished with that question. And we're going to say set loading equal to false. Now we could put this in a promise as well or use .then.catch, but this is totally fine. This will take a second. We're going to wait for that function to execute. And again, if we go to the backend, you can see that we called it ask question. Because we marked it executable, we're able to actually execute the function like this, right? Using that, it's going to go grab that query for us using our database and then give us that response in the front end. So actually, before I test this out, I'm just going to write the loading indicator because it can take a second to execute. And I want to make sure that we have something that shows us that it's loading. I know we have the text right now, but it's not really a good indication. So let's make a new file called loading indicator.tsx. And inside of here, let's write the component. So we're just going to say import React from React. We're then going to say const, if we can type this correctly, loading, or actually let's do it how we've always done it, function loading indicator, and then function. And here we're going to just return a div. This div is going to have a class name equal to loading dash indicator. Okay, and that's actually all we need. Now we can just say export default loading indicator, and we can add some CSS. So we're going to make a new CSS file, and we're going to say loading indicator.css. We're going to import that from here. So we're going to say import /loading indicator.css, and then we're going to copy in the CSS, which is just a simple animation. So let's copy that, and we will put that here. You can get rid of the name, and it's just going to have a nice spinning animation while this is rendering. Okay, so now we have the loading indicator. Let's use it. So here, rather than loading, we're just going to render the loading indicator. And there we go. Let's save, and that looks better. Okay, so now we can go back here and test this out. I'm gonna say, hey, what trip do I have in Barbados? Okay, and we're going to ask that, and now you see our beautiful loading indicator. Okay, so you can see that this returned the answer. It says you have one trip in Barbados. Here are the different details, and then it gives us the notes, the start date, the end date, etc. Obviously, we can ask this a lot more questions, but already pretty cool. It can use our data to give us a relevant reply. We could also integrate this with a lot of other AI features so that it gets this and then passes it to some other AI that gives us maybe recommendations or something along those lines, but that is kind of the basic functionality. Okay, so now the core application is done, right? It's working, we can delete stuff, we can add stuff. We have the AI integration using Squid AI, and the next step is to actually deploy this out or see how you would deploy this application. Now there's a ton of other stuff you'd probably want to add to this to really polish it up, but this is kind of at least where I want to leave it for now so that you guys can make this your own and you're not just copying exactly what I have. Anyways, let's talk about the deployment process. So within the Squid Cloud console here, the Squid AI console, you can see that we actually have different environments. We have a dev environment and a production environment. Now, obviously, when you're doing development, you're going to work in the dev environment, and when you're going to production, you're going to go to the prod environment. But in our case right now, our backend is just running locally on our own computer. So what we're going to do now is actually deploy the backend to the dev environment so that someone that maybe is not running this backend but wants to be integrating with our project or messing around with it can still use that. Now, this is kind of an intermediary between, full development, which is happening on our local machine, and production. So we're going to deploy to this dev environment and then connect to it. But obviously, if you want to go to production, then you can deploy to prod. Now, I'm going to leave a link to a great script or a great kind of piece of documentation in the description that breaks down exactly what the difference between these environments are and how to do the deployment. But I'll show you the simple deployment, in this case, to the dev backend environment. So let's go here, and you can see that if we go deploy your backend, it actually gives us the script that we can run. Now, we don't need to run this script directly. Instead, what we can do is we can go here and we can just shut down our project quickly. So let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to cd into our backend directory. From here, we can simply run the script, which is npm run deploy. And then when we do that, we're going to end up deploying to that dev environment. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so this script is running, and you can see that it is deploying this to the backend dev environment. And then I'm going to show you from the front end how we make it so we're going to connect to this deployed dev backend rather than the one that's running locally on our computer. Okay, so our code has been deployed now, and I want to show you how we connect to this environment. So instead of connecting to the locally deployed backend, which could be changing constantly, it might have bugs, it might be just what we're using ourselves to actually test things out, we might want to connect to the dev backend, which maybe has some kind of stable version of the app. And even though that's not necessarily in production, you can treat it almost like a staging environment. You can use it in different ways, and you can check out that documentation, but there's reasons why you might want to connect to that backend versus the locally running backend. Now, to do that, you need to go to the front end directory, which we have open right here, and to main.tsx, and you just need to remove the Squid developer ID. When you remove this, it's just telling your code actually to connect to the deployed dev backend rather than the local backend. So now that we've done that, what we can do is we can just cd into the front end directory, and rather than running both the front end and the back end, we can just run the front end, and we can do that with npm run dev. So now it's just going to run the front end as we had before. And if we go back to our app, you can see that it is running. And now we can just try doing what we did before. So let's try to maybe delete the note. You can see that works. Let's try to add a new country, maybe Taiwan, and we can go, I don't know, let's go July 10th to the 12th, even though that date's already passed, that's fine. We can add that in. We're going to say, hello world, new note. Okay, add that in. We say we want, or I want to learn the language. Okay, that's fine. Now let's ask a question. What am I doing in Taiwan? Okay, and it should give us some response and maybe tell us about the notes that we have there. So you can see here we got a response and it says that we have an interest in learning the language. Then it just came up with something that's reasonable for hello world new note. And it suggests we're both exploring and engaging with the culture of Taiwan. Okay, it's not necessarily true, but that's fine. It's just coming up with something that is reasonable. And again, here we are connected to the deployed dev backend, not the local backend, because that's actually not even running. We're just using the front end here, which is again is another reason why I like Squid, because it's just so easy to do that deployment and get our code in a way that we can actually start sharing it with other people. So that is pretty much it for this video. If you wanted to view some logs or you want to check out the backend yourself, you can go and see the different integrations. For example, we can see in the backend that we have the executable functions. So ask question, we have one execution, gives us the latency, etc. We can go and look at things like the usage, logs, and you can see the log that was generated when we actually asked that question. So I think, guys, with that said, I am going to wrap up the video here. Hopefully you enjoyed this application. You learned a bit about Squid and how to create a cool AI app with a front end, back end, and full deployment. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.